Hi, it's Daniel from Theology is for Everyone, and I'm here with more insights in Matthew. Chapter 10 is actually well known to a lot of people because there are a lot of passages or verses that are quoted from this. And this is one of about three things that we need to make sure we point out as we come to the chapter. Verses like, be as shrewd as serpents and harmless as doves. Give a cup of cold water in my name. Freely you have received, freely give. A sparrow is important to God, and you're more important than that. All the hairs of your head are numbered, that sort of thing. All these are found in Matthew chapter 10, and I'm sure you're familiar with many, if not most of them. The second thing to remember is that as much as Matthew chapter 10 is well known from some of these verses, many of them are taken out of context and misapplied or misinterpreted because they're not placed in the context in which they were given. Thirdly, there is a lot of Matthew chapter 10 that is still unfulfilled or only partially fulfilled prophecy. And we'll see this in just a minute. So let's understand what the context is. Just in case we were not sure who this chapter should apply to, we're told about 5 times in the chapter who it applies to directly. So for instance, in verse 1, Jesus called his 12 disciples, and it's to them that he gave this instruction and the authority, the 12 disciples. In verse 2, now these are the names of the 12 apostles. So that's the second time that we see the 12. Verse 5, Jesus sent out these 12. That's the third time we see the 12. The chapter really ends with the first verse of chapter 11, because in 11:1 it says, when Jesus had finished instructing his 12 disciples, he went out from there to teach and preach. So 4 times in this chapter or in this section, we're told that the instructions are for the 12. And just in case we might not know who the 12 are, maybe I'm one of the 12, maybe these are instructions given to me today. Well, verses 2, 3, and 4 actually name the 12. Peter and Andrew and James and John and all the rest. Chapter 10 was given specifically to 12 men, and so the instructions and the commands are given to 12 men. Are there some timeless truths in here? Yes, there are some timeless truths. Are there general principles? Yes. But the commands and the instructions, we have to be very careful taking these commands that were given to 12 men in a very specific time and place and applying them to ourselves. And we get in trouble if we don't do that very carefully. I'll give you an example. There are many preachers and today all around the world, especially in the charismatic movement, that love verse 7 and 8. As you go preach the message, the kingdom of heaven is near, and heal the sick and raise the dead and cleanse lepers and cast out demons. And they say these are things that we should be experiencing today. These should be normal today as we are preaching the kingdom of heaven. And we've already talked about the fact that in previous chapters that we should not even really be preaching the kingdom of heaven. We should be preaching the gospel of the cross, not the gospel of the kingdom. But let's set that aside for a minute. As we are preaching, we should be doing all of these things. And so we see a lot of word of faith and charismatic preachers preaching all these things. They're missing 2 things. First of all, I find it really interesting that rarely do they finish verse 8, because the last phrase of verse 8 says, freely you received, freely give. And too many of these preachers all over the world, in the United States and so many other places, soak their followers for everything that they've got. And they live lavish lifestyles. And that's definitely not in keeping with the instructions here. So there's definitely some context there. But here's another one that they miss. It's in verse 6, or 5 and 6. Jesus specifically told the 12 not to go to the Gentiles, not to go to Gentile regions, not to Samaritans, but they were to focus at this time solely on Israel. We don't see the people doing that today. In fact, most people don't preach to Jews or the lost sheep of the house of Israel at all. They've ignored Israel, which I don't think is right either. And so the context is, at this moment, Jesus sent the 12 only to Israel, not Gentiles, not Samaritans, and they were supposed to preach a very specific gospel, the kingdom is at hand, that we don't preach, and they were supposed to do things to prove that the message they were preaching about the kingdom was true. Well, we're supposed to go to all nations, according to Matthew chapter 28, make disciples of all nations, not just Israel. We're preaching a different gospel, and so it seems like the miracles or whatever that the authentication that goes along with our message would be different. And so a couple of things that show that this is not applicable to us today. Well, what about verse 19? When they hand you over for trial, don't worry about how you should speak or what you should say, because that's going to be given to you at that time, and the Holy Spirit's going to speak for you. Is that applicable today? Yeah, possibly. But in context, if the kingdom was received by the nation of Israel, Jesus would have been put to death by the Romans for treason. He was going to die anyway. That's prophesied in the Old Testament. And what's also prophesied in the Old Testament is a period of harshness, a hard time, trial, tribulation. We call the future trial a tribulation, the Great Tribulation. That was going to happen anyway. And so if Rome squashed and killed Jesus and executed Jesus for trying to set up a kingdom underneath Rome, don't you think his followers probably would have been persecuted as well? And the fact of the matter is that they will be in the future. And so, are these things true? Should we be careful? Should we not worry about what to say at all? I don't think the New Testament says that. We're supposed to identify false teachers. We have a very specific thing that we are supposed to preach and teach. And when we stand before people, when we stand before, if we're arrested and persecuted, if we stand before them, do we have to have a message? Well, maybe. Should we rely on the Holy Spirit? Yeah, we can definitely do that. But again, let's not take that timeless truth or that principle out of the context that when they were preaching the kingdom, and in the future when the kingdom is preached again in the tribulation, the message that they have is going to come from the Holy Spirit. Do not think that I have come to bring peace on the earth. I've not come to bring peace, but a sword. That's absolutely true. When we follow Christ, we cause division. It's absolutely true. One day he will bring peace, but unfortunately that day is not yet today. Whoever loves father or mother more than me is not worthy of me. That's just the cost of discipleship. It costs very little to become a child of God. It costs us, it costs us very little to become a child of God. It cost Jesus his life. We simply have to believe. But the cost of discipleship, the cost to following him, is immense in this life. But when we do it well, the reward is great in the next life. There is so much to be discovered here in chapter 10. But let me encourage you, as you read this chapter and as you meditate on this, try to find those things which are timeless, those principles that are timeless, without abusing the chapter and taking it out of the context in which it was originally given. The instructions to the 12 disciples who are now full-time apostles of Jesus, carrying his message, doing the miracles, which, by the way, includes Judas Iscariot, an unbeliever. Just because somebody can do a miracle doesn't mean that they're a believer. And keep it in the context of what was going on when it happened. See you next time.